politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us today here on Point of View. It is our pre-Thanksgiving program, and if you tune in and actually watch the broadcast, either by going to Facebook Live or to pointofview.net, you will see that I am dressed for the occasion. And so that is one of the things that we have done today, and which we really want to do a little bit of teaching about Thanksgiving and its importance. By the way, let me just mention that we've posted quite a number of articles for you. First of all, one that I'll be reading from in just a minute. Jarrett Stepman, here's why we should still celebrate the Pilgrims at Thanksgiving. We'll get into that. New one just came out today by Jerry Newcomb, and it's entitled "The Pilgrims Gave Thanks Despite Many Difficulties." And so, again, we may use that later in the program. We also have posted our annual Thanksgiving quiz. And in just a few minutes after reading this initial article by Jarrett Stepman, we will get into some of the lessons that I think we can learn here in the 21st century from those in the 17th century, the Pilgrims. And so we'll get into all sorts of issues, but we also have our Thanksgiving quiz. Let me just mention that if you're not familiar with Point of View, we have done this for many years. We started this at Pro Ministries, where we have it available as well. But on this website, pointofview.net, it is the article which allows you to actually print it out and then use that around the Thanksgiving table. There are 20 questions with answers. Some are pretty simple so that the young children can answer those with some enthusiasm. There are a few that have a little more detail to them, so even adults around the table can participate. And we developed those years ago for a very good reason. You know, when we would oftentimes at Thanksgiving, around the Thanksgiving table, ask the kids what they were thankful for. After a couple of years of "I'm thankful for my cat," "I'm thankful for my Beanie Babies," or whatever, I said, you know, we need to use this as an opportunity to teach. Let's face it, a lot of the holidays have been secularized, and as we get to Christmas, we certainly understand that. But this is one holiday which, of course, it's a lot about eating turkey and watching football games, but still, it still has a lot of the original intent, especially if we're willing to teach that around the table. So the Thanksgiving quiz is our gift to you to use to really educate your children, your grandchildren, and yourself about this. And as we're going through this today, I suspect many of you are traveling. Some of you are in the kitchen baking. But if you want to get some of your young children around to listen, one of the things I hear so often is after we do a program like this where we're doing some teaching, they say, well, I wish my children or my grandchildren could hear this because they have not been taught this in the schools. And so this is a way to maybe rectify some of that. And so let me get to our first article that we've posted. It is entitled, again, "Here's Why We Should Still Celebrate the Pilgrims at Thanksgiving." And Jarrett says, well, for most American families, Thanksgiving is a time to gather with loved ones, to eat delicious food, and perhaps watch some football. But not everyone is pleased, he says, with the celebration of this holiday, and some have taken to maligning its originators, the Pilgrims. One editorial labeled Thanksgiving a thoroughly nauseating affair, one that is saturated with disgrace. Other articles have called the Pilgrims genocidal towards the Native Americans, which, by the way, is not true, and we'll get into that a little bit later, or argued that the original idea of a Thanksgiving feast is a myth, not true as well. Debunking the nature and origin of Thanksgiving seems to be turning into its own cottage industry, he says. But he says the Pilgrim Thanksgiving story is based on real events. Small band of religious dissenters who crossed an ocean to a dangerous new world have rightly been given special prominence in the origin story of the United States. This wasn't the first time Thanksgiving, by the way, that was celebrated on this continent. It certainly was one of the most significant, and the reason it is maintained to this very day. But he goes back on to say that a year after the Pilgrims landed in what is now Massachusetts, Governor William Bradford called for a day of Thanksgiving. And then he quotes from historian Rod Gregg. Let me just mention that oftentimes on Thanksgiving, we actually play an interview I did with historian Ron Gregg a number of years ago, and we may do that sometime again in the future. But Rod Gregg says the Pilgrims were not the first Europeans to hold a Thanksgiving event in the New World, although they appear to be the first to do so in New England. It was the Pilgrims of Plymouth, however, who would be credited with establishing America's distinctive Thanksgiving holiday, thanks to a joyful observance sometime in the autumn of 1621. I'll get back to that a little bit later. The Pilgrims gathered for a 3-day feast with the 90 local Wampanoag Indians to celebrate a bountiful harvest following a year of toil. As you may remember, if you know your history, almost half of the Pilgrims died during that first miserable winter of 1620. Though he says the food on the menu excluded modern items like a pumpkin pie and cranberry sauce, those who gathered for the Thanksgiving likely ate wild turkey, among other foods common in the area like venison and shellfish. While later conflicts would ensue between the Pilgrims' descendants and the descendants of the Indians who feasted with them, the initial contact between the cultures was positive and beneficial. Political misunderstandings unfortunately led to future conflicts. In particular, might be talking about King Philip's War. Anyway, he goes on to say that the Pilgrims would certainly be foreign to the conventions of modern America. They were, after all, a different people who lived in a harsher world than ours, but they don't deserve to be maligned as genocidal monsters, nor should we dismiss the fact that they set incredibly beneficial norms for a future American culture. They go on to talk about some of the benefits that we embrace, but one of those that he talks about later in the article, and again, we've posted the entire article for you to read, maybe even to read around the Thanksgiving table, has to do with the fact that they landed about 250 miles north, and we'll get into this more in the second segment here, but because of that, they had to write, if you will, a new covenant, and so they wrote what today we call the Mayflower Compact. And Jarrett Stepman puts it this way. He says, the Mayflower Compact, a relatively simple document, established a kind of covenant between the citizens of the new colony. It was the first such document in the New World, creating a civil body politic through clear written guidelines. It was an indirect antecedent to the Constitution of the United States and our tradition of placing laws above men. Goes on to say that the modern holiday of Thanksgiving evolved from being a regional and haphazard one to a national one. Notable New England orators, such as Daniel Webster, kept the Pilgrim flame alive in the early 19th century by singing songs of remembrance of their way of life on the Forefathers' Day, a Thanksgiving precursor to what today is celebrated in Plymouth, Massachusetts. And finally, Thanksgiving, as we know it, never became a formal holiday until 1863, when President Abraham Lincoln nationally recognized it. Magazine editor Sarah Joseph Hale had advocated a national Thanksgiving holiday for decades. He says Thanksgiving has grown to become a significant part of our nation's shared cultural inheritance, and though our customs have evolved over the years, Thanksgiving has retained a permanent connection to its origins with the Pilgrims of New England, and for that, we can be thankful. That is the first article we've posted on our website, and you can find that at pointofview.net. A little bit later, I want to open up the phones and get your comments. We certainly want to make available to you the Thanksgiving quiz, but also we want to suggest that maybe there's some other things that we can do around the Thanksgiving table, and I'd love to get some of your advice as well. When we come back, let me do a teaching. What are some lessons we can learn from Thanksgiving? I think you'll be surprised. There are many we can learn from the Pilgrims. We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Thanksgiving is tomorrow, and I suspect that you are doing lots of things to get ready for this special day. Let me suggest you add one more item to your to-do list. Visit our website and download a copy of my Thanksgiving quiz. Thanksgiving is a wonderful time to gather as a family, but I also believe that it can be a great time to teach our children and grandchildren about America's godly heritage. I created this short quiz to be a conversation starter around the Thanksgiving table. You know, we used to go around the table before the meal and ask our children to tell us what they were thankful for. After a few years of hearing about how they were thankful for their cat, their doll, their video games, I knew we needed to do something else. The Thanksgiving quiz was born out of that frustration. It has 19 questions and answers on the Pilgrims and the Mayflower Compact, as well as some questions and answers about the Christian heritage of America. Who were the Pilgrims, and why did they leave Europe for America? Why did they celebrate Thanksgiving? What is the Mayflower Compact, and why is it significant? What lessons did the Pilgrims learn about work and even free enterprise? How did the Christian faith influence America? These are just a few of the sort of questions that you can ask around the table and give short answers. Perhaps it is time to recapture the importance of Thanksgiving. On the bicentennial celebration of the landing of the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock, Daniel Webster declared the following: "Let us not forget the religious character of our origin. Our fathers were brought hither by their high veneration for the Christian religion. They journeyed by its light and labored in its hope, and they sought to incorporate its principles with the elements of their society and diffuse its influence through all their institutions, civil, political, or literary." It is my hope that this quiz will help your family see the importance of Thanksgiving. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Affirm Films and Sony Pictures Animation present The Star, The First Christmas Through a Whole New Set of Eyes. The Star, now playing rated PG, thestarmovie.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Today on Point of View, it is our pre-Thanksgiving program, and if you'd like to join us at any point, 1-800-351-1212. Let me share, if I could, some lessons from Thanksgiving, but first, maybe need to have a little bit of historical perspective, because, as you know, Thanksgiving was a day of Thanksgiving that was set aside by the Pilgrims who founded the Plymouth colony. That really was the first permanent settlement in New England. Now, there is evidence of other Thanksgivings. For example, in 1541, there's a suggestion maybe there was a Thanksgiving in Paladuro Canyon in Texas with Coronado and his men. We have in Florida, in St. Augustine, Florida, you have 1564, the Huguenots, and you also, of course, with Jamestown in 1607, have something that is a little bit like this, but really the Thanksgiving that we think about really is tied to the Pilgrims. Now, we know quite a bit about them. Sometimes people say, well, this is all a myth. Well, it turns out that it is not, for no other reason than we have, for example, the writings by William Bradford of the Plymouth Plantation from 1620 to 1647. And so you can read about that in some leisure if you want. I mentioned Rod Gregg just a minute ago. We're going to a little bit later talk about his book, The Pilgrim Chronicles, an eyewitness history to the Pilgrims and the founding of the Plymouth colony. And Jerry Newcomb, who knows a lot about American history, said there were things he learned in that book. And, of course, we did an interview with Rod Gregg a couple of years ago and from time to time play that during Thanksgiving Day. Where did the term pilgrim come from? They were originally kind of known as the forefathers. They sometimes were known as the founders. They were separatist. What do I mean by that? We had the Church of England, and they wanted to separate from that. They were convinced that this was not biblical, that many of the things that were happening within the church were things they could not endorse. And so as a result, they were separatist and eventually decided to leave England and go to the Netherlands. And they were enlightened the Netherlands. So they really, at one point, thought maybe that would fit their needs. but they began to be concerned even about some of the decadence that the young children were being affected by there. Isn't that amazing? The parents were concerned about the culture even back in the 17th century. And of course, we're very concerned about the culture and how it influences our children today. So that's why they decided to get on to the Mayflower and sail across the Atlantic. No small venture, by the way. You have ever had a chance to see replicas of some of these ships. If you go to Jamestown, you see the size of some of the ships. You go to some other places, and you can see that your house may be about as big as this boat that they are going to get on and then sail across the Atlantic. Well, nevertheless, as I alluded to just a minute ago, they were blown off course. There's some evidence that suggests that maybe they actually had the sailors deliberately take them off course. But anyway, they were supposed to settle in what at that time was called Northern Virginia. Now, Northern Virginia back then went all the way up to today we call present-day New York. But still, they were still too far north and up in the Massachusetts area. They tried to sail back further south, could not do so, and finally decided to settle in what is now known as Plymouth Colony. In a minute, I'm going to talk about what they had to do before they established themselves, and that is the Mayflower Compact. But let me read one of the quotes that we have here. It says, "Being thus arrived in a good harbor and brought safe to land, they fell upon their knees and blessed the God of heaven, who had brought them over the vast and furious ocean, and delivered them from all the perils and miseries thereof, again to set their feet on the firm and stable earth." And so they were grateful to be able to make land and to then begin the process of establishing quickly a colony before the winter sets in. But before they established that, they actually drafted what was called today the Mayflower Compact. And this is one of the quotes just a minute ago from Jarrett Stepman illustrates was really sort of an antecedent or a beginning of what today we have as our Constitution. But again, recognize this was in 1620, not 1789 when we write our Constitution, but already we can see its very significant impact. It said, "In the name of God, amen, whose name are underwritten the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord King James by the grace of God, having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith and honor of our king and country a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic, for better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends foresaid, and by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time, as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. In witness thereof, we have hereunder subscribed our names at Cape Cod, 11th of November in the year of our reign of our sovereign Lord, King James of England, France, and Ireland, Anno Domini 1620. And so we can see that this was very significant. I'll come back to some of the political lessons we can learn. But as I alluded to just a few minutes ago, life was very hard because after that first year, 51 individuals had died during this terrible winter. And so after the first harvest was completed, Governor William Bradford proclaimed a day of thanksgiving and prayer. And so they reaped a bountiful harvest. Edward Winslow put it this way, said, "God be praised, we had a good increase of corn, and by the goodness of God we are far from want." And so also declared a 3-day feast in December of 1621 to thank God and also to celebrate that with the Indians. While we're talking about Thanksgiving, there was another one that happened in 1623 in which they held a day of fasting and prayer during a time when there had been a very significant drought. And so they were fasting and praying, and then the rains came, but it was a very gentle rain that did not destroy the crops. And so again, they had another day in which they had Thanksgiving, in which it moved from a day of fasting and prayer to a day of Thanksgiving in 1623. And that began to be the actual beginnings of what today we consider to be this idea of Thanksgiving. Now, at the same time, we can see that God's hand was in the midst of this. That is, they were blown off course and landed in Cape Cod. They tried to actually sail south, but had not been able to do so. But the fact that they landed there in 1620 also shows, I believe, God's hand. Had they arrived just a few years earlier, they would have probably been attacked and probably destroyed by one of the fiercest tribes in the region. But in 1617, just a few years before, the Patuxet tribe had been wiped out by a plague, and so they landed in really one of the few places where they could survive. But there was a survivor of that tribe. He was not there when the plague struck them. Instead, this man by the name of Squanto, which you've probably heard about before, and I might mention a very good book on Squanto was written by Eric Metaxas. People know Eric Metaxas as an individual that has written all sorts of very good biographies about William Wilberforce and Dietrich Bonhoeffer and more recently Martin Luther. But this book by Squanto was written many years ago before most people actually knew who Eric Metaxas was. But nevertheless, he was kidnapped many years before by a captain. He was taken to England. He learned English. Eventually, he learned some other things from other individuals and eventually made his way back to this region. But, of course, now, having been able to learn some of the ways of the white man and having learned English, he found himself just simply working with some of the nearby tribes. But when he learned that the Pilgrims were in Plymouth, he came to them speaking English, and they were absolutely shocked that this Indian spoke English as well as he did. He showed them how to plant corn, how to fertilize with fish, and William Bradford later wrote about Squanto that he was, quote, a special instrument sent of God for their good beyond their expectations. Let's take a break. When we come back, I want to talk a little bit about the legacy of Thanksgiving. I mentioned Daniel Webster just a minute ago. And interestingly enough, on the bicentennial, the 200th anniversary of the Pilgrims landing at Plymouth Rock in 1820, Daniel Webster declared that this was to be a very special event in the history of America that we needed to observe. And so now as we are getting closer to the 400th anniversary, it will be interesting to see if we have the same kind of enthusiasm that people like Daniel Webster and others had in 1820. But we need to take a break. We're going to continue talking about some of the lessons from Thanksgiving. Hope, again, that you will benefit from some of the material we've posted on our website at pointofview.net. We'll continue our conversation and teaching right after this.
Affirm Films and Sony Pictures Animation present The Star, the fully animated story of the first Christmas told through a whole new set of eyes. Bo the donkey and his stable of animal friends follow the star to become some unlikely heroes.
That light, that's the star. This is where it's been leading me.
What's his name?
His name is Jesus.
The Star, now playing. Rated PG, parental guidance suggested. More information is available at thestarmovie.com.
If you were homeless and on the run, all because you love Jesus, would you want Christians to step up and help? Our family in the Middle East, the cradle of our faith, is in desperate need because of ISIS and other persecutors. Point of View urges you to support the Cradle Fund today to help these precious believers. Please give at pointofview.net/Cradle Fund or call 1-800-347-5151. pointofview.net/Cradle Fund and 800-347-5151. Or write Cradle Fund in the memo of your check to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Celebrating Thanksgiving, talking about Thanksgiving, teaching about it today as well. And if you'd like to join us at any point, 1-800-351-1212. Just joined us, one of our first articles, Why We Should Still Celebrate Thanksgiving, by Jarrett Stepman. A little bit later, I'm going to read another one, perhaps in the second hour, by Jerry Newcomb. We also have our Thanksgiving quiz. And I've been sort of working our way through some of the lessons we can learn from Thanksgiving. And just before we took a break, I talked about the fact that for many years, Thanksgiving was celebrated before it was an official holiday, simply as a time in which it celebrated the founding of our country. And in 1820, this is now 200 years after 1620, there was what was called the bicentennial celebration of the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock. And so on that occasion, there was a desire to have a very well-known orator, Daniel Webster, yes, that Webster, declared the following at that bicentennial celebration. He said, "Let us not forget the religious character of our origin. Our fathers were brought hither by their high veneration for the Christian religion. They journeyed by its light and labored in its hope. They sought to incorporate its principles with the elements of their society and to diffuse its influence through all of its institutions, civil, political, or literary." And so it helps you understand that 200 years ago, there was a celebration of the landing of the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock. I suspect that in a few years, when we have the commemoration, and it might be just the opposite, a lack of celebration in, say, 2020 of this, that it will be anything like that. And if there's any lesson to be learned, it is that our culture has changed. The story is the same 200 years after as it is 400 years after, but the culture has changed. And as we see now, we hear comments about genocide, about this is a nauseating affair, as I read just a minute ago, and all the rest. But let's talk about some of the lessons I think we can learn from this event, and these are lessons you may want to share around your table this Thanksgiving. The first, of course, are spiritual lessons, and they relate in large part to our religious liberty. Because think about this, the Pilgrims really valued their religious freedom. They were willing to endure hardship. Matter of fact, think about how many died just that first year so that they could come to a country and freely worship. Among those, of course, were those individuals, as I mentioned, that were separatists who wanted to break from the Church of England. And so that's why in 1606, William Brewster led a group of these separatists to Leiden in the Netherlands to escape the religious persecution in England. Now, as I mentioned, after living there for more than 10 years, some of the members decided to emigrate to the United States. Of course, at that time, it was just called America or the New World. But this, again, they wanted to escape what they felt was the decadence of the old world and really begin for the first time to experience what they hoped would be religious freedom. Here, again, if I could quote from William Bradford, he said, "Last and not least, they cherished a great hope and an inward zeal, or at least of making some way towards it, for the propagation and advance of the gospel of the kingdom of Christ in the remote parts of the world, even though they should be but stepping stones to others in the performance so great a work." So they recognized that, first of all, they would experience religious freedom, that they would also bring the gospel to this new world, and yet they recognized that they might only be the stepping stones. They might be the foundation upon which others would stand upon them and do so. To understand a little bit more, you have to realize, interestingly enough, that when they landed in America, they actually had a different Bible. Now, their king was King James. I just read that a minute ago. So you would think that they would have a King James Bible. After all, it was published in 1611. So wouldn't the Bible that these Puritans and Pilgrims and others would have would be a King James Bible? Not so. Actually, they had a Geneva Bible, which was published in 1560. And if you want to understand what we talked about last month when we talked about the Protestant Reformation, prior to the Reformation, very few had access to a Bible. So then, of course, you had Luther's German Bible in 1534, and you had the Geneva Bible in English in 1560, and it was made possible for the Christians to hold a Bible in their own hands for personal study and family research and reading. And this was the Bible that they actually had. And the reason this was in their hands, in some respects, goes back to the fact that they were separatist, because the notes in the Geneva Bible actually upset King James, because these notes in the Geneva Bible said that the law of God was supreme over the king, and that the king was not supreme. And so this is why King James really, in part, wanted to have what today is called the King James Bible. He had Bible scholars to come up with a new translation of the Bible. But it is kind of interesting because it gets us back to this idea of religious liberty. If you listen to this program any length of time, you know that on Fridays, we almost always do a religious liberty segment with Kelly Shackelford of First Liberty or other individuals that might be able to join us. And again, let's remember that one of the reasons the Puritans came here, one of the reasons the Pilgrims came here, one of the reasons many of the other separatists like the Quakers came here was because of the need for and the desire for religious liberty. So that's the first lesson. There's also a political lesson, and that is the Mayflower Compact. Because the Mayflower Compact, as many people have said, was the first constitution in America. It's often been called the American Covenant. And it really set forth principles of self-government for the first time, and these were set forth really 150 years before we have our Constitution. Don't take my word for it. Let's look at what Winston Churchill had to say. Winston Churchill said in his book, A History of the English-Speaking People, he said that the Pilgrims drew up a solemn compact that was one of the most remarkable documents in history, a spontaneous covenant for political organization. Let's listen to someone else. Paul Johnson, a British historian, has written a very good book, which I could commend to you, called A History of the American People. And Paul Johnson says what was remarkable about this particular contract was that it was not between a servant and a master, or a people and a king, but between a group of like-minded individuals and each other, with God as a witness and symbolic co-signatory. And so you can see that this again established what today we now take for granted as a republic, a constitutional republic. We can move from the Pilgrims to the Puritans. I've mentioned their name a few times here. And in Massachusetts Bay Colony, they created some Bible-based commonwealths, and they actually established some principles there as well. The Puritans actually put together another covenant because up until that time, there was really no written constitution in England, and so a lot of it was oral tradition. And the Puritans decided to actually anchor their liberties in a written page, which actually were ideas that we can find even in the Bible itself. We'll talk more about this in the second hour, but let me mention just before we go to a break that you can look up, for example, on a Google search, the Body of Liberties. That was actually written in 1641. It contains 98 separate protections for individual rights, including due process of law, equal protection, a trial by a jury of your peers, and also it has prohibitions against cruel and unusual punishment. Where have you heard that phrase before? That's the Eighth Amendment of the Constitution. And just an illustration again of some of these ideas that were already in seminal form in the 17th century, in many cases 150 years to 120 years before we actually have the U.S. Constitution. And you can see again, these are some great lessons we can learn from the Pilgrims and even, as I mentioned, the Puritans. Let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to also talk about some other lessons. We've talked about some spiritual and religious lessons, and certainly political lessons in terms of religious liberty. We also have seen some other political lessons in terms of this idea of what eventually became a representative form of government and actually having rules and laws and rights and responsibilities written down. But I also want to talk about some of the economic lessons, because the Pilgrims floundered until William Bradford recognized we need to take into account human sinfulness, ambition, laziness, and we need to restructure what we do economically so that the colony will flourish. We'll talk about that right after these important messages.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Can county commissioners open their own meetings with prayer? The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit recently prohibited Rowan County's commissioners from opening their meetings with prayer. But the federal courts of appeal are split over whether prayers offered by legislators at local government meetings are unconstitutional. In another one of our cases, Bournemouth versus County of Jackson, the Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit approved of the very same practice. Opening government meetings with prayer is a centuries-old tradition that goes back to before the founding of our nation and continues to this day before Congress, state houses, and thousands of local governments across the country. It shouldn't be very controversial. The Supreme Court previously approved of the long-standing tradition of legislative prayer and its role in solemnizing policymaking sessions, encouraging lawmakers to selflessly seek the greater good, and acknowledging the role that faith plays in the lives of millions of Americans. In 1983, in Marsh v. Chambers, and then again in Town of Greece v. Galloway, the Supreme Court held that prayers offered by private citizens before government meetings are fully consistent with the Constitution and an important part of America's history and heritage. But what if that citizen is an elected official? That's the question we hope the Supreme Court will now answer. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. You can protect your religious freedom by going to firstliberty.org to download your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit. Our attorneys created kits for churches, ministries, Christian schools, military members, students, and teachers, and the workplace. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you just joined us, we're talking a little bit about some of the lessons we can learn from Thanksgiving. Certainly want to wish you and your family a gracious Thanksgiving and a time to express our thankfulness, our gratitude. For those of you, by the way, that are interested in the word gratitude, very good piece that came out just recently by Dennis Prager at Prager University on gratitude, so I would commend that to you as well. But we've talked a little bit about some of the spiritual lessons from Thanksgiving, if you will, some of the political and religious liberty lessons from Thanksgiving, as well as other political lessons related to, for example, our representative form of government. But what about economic lessons? This was a problem really almost from the beginning in Plymouth Colony, because after the first year, the colony was just floundering because of the collective economic system. That is, each one of the colonists worked only for the joint partnership and were fed out of the common stores. To put it simply, each one worked according to their ability, and each one received according to their need. Okay, well, you can kind of figure out what that sounds like. A little bit like socialism, doesn't it? If there's a lesson we want to pass on to a lot of the young people today, is that socialism doesn't work, and you don't have to look at the recent studies that have been done by the American Enterprise Institute or the Heritage Foundation, or look at the failure of socialism in every country from the Soviet Union to Venezuela. You can just simply go back to the 17th century and recognize that the problem was this. The land and the houses were all joint property of the merchants back in England, and so the colonists, in a sense, were working for the joint store, and there were complaints that Bradford records of those who were able-bodied and working and noticing others that might have been able-bodied or might not have been able to participate as much, and there was really nothing that was working in terms of this communal farming. So William Bradford, seeing the failure of this communal farming, instituted what today we would call free enterprise innovations. He assigned plots of land to each family to work, and so they had a responsibility communally, but they also could benefit from their own hard work. And so the colonists then were challenged to better themselves and their land, and they started working to their fullest capacity. So long before you had an adequate defense of what we today would call the free market. Recognize that was written by Adam Smith in 1776. But we're talking about what happened in 1621. You can see the incredible impact that that was already starting to have. By the way, this was a lesson also learned at Jamestown. I might point that out as well. Thomas Dale, who was the governor there at Jamestown, realized that there was really no connection between work and reward in the Jamestown colony. So he gave each man 3 acres of land and required for them to work no more than 1 month for the common stores. So in a sense, that 1 month requirement was essentially a flat tax of 8.3%. Wouldn't you like that tax rate today? But again, you can see how some of these economic lessons surface out of the Pilgrim colony as well as some of the spiritual, religious, and political lessons. But before we wind down this first hour, let's talk a little bit about the history of Thanksgiving, because long before we had the official history and holiday of Thanksgiving, we had lots of Thanksgiving celebrations. As a matter of fact, there were various Thanksgiving celebrations that spread throughout the colonies, especially during the American Revolution. As best as I can count, Congress issued at least 8 separate national Thanksgiving proclamations. We have Congress issued 7 separate proclamations for times of prayer and fasting. And then you had also then, when you add the two together, 15 official prayer proclamations that were actually made just during the American Revolution. Well, then let's, if we can, talk about some of the things that were instituted not only by Congress, but even by, at that time, the General George Washington. Of course, later he became President George Washington. 5 months after the Declaration, there was a real concern, and as they wrote it, they said, the pinch and suffering of war and a poor harvest seriously imperiled morale. If you've ever read the book 1776, you recognize how close we were to ending the American Revolution after the first year in 1776. So Congress set aside a day of fasting and repentance on December 11th, 1776. And I think most of you, if you've studied anything about history, recognize the victories that George Washington had at Princeton and Trenton that kept individuals with the military willing to continue to fight, eventually achieving some level of success in various battles all the way to Yorktown. Now, interestingly enough, at the end of the 3rd year of the war, there was a day of Thanksgiving that was established as well, and Congress had many reasons to express thanksgiving to God and to seek his continued mercy and also his assistance. So then you have some other situations as well. George Washington issued a Thanksgiving proclamation in 1789 about our duty to God. And then you also have another Thanksgiving proclamation in 1795 describing God's beneficence in the world. And so those were very significant times during the American Revolution, leading all the way up to his presidency. But let's go back to this idea of Thanksgiving, because there were times in which, even though it wasn't an official holiday, the Thanksgiving Day was reminding people of the need to be thankful to God. John Witherspoon was the president of the College of New Jersey, later, of course, now is known as Princeton, and he was a signer of the Declaration. He called upon to draft a Thanksgiving Day recollection of those events. And, of course, we also have George Washington, after their victories, recounting the protection of God and the Battle of Long Island and certain other situations. So finally, we come to what I mentioned at the outset, and that is Sarah Josepha Hale convinced Abraham Lincoln to declare a national day of Thanksgiving. And this proclamation came, interestingly enough, after the Battle of Gettysburg. And so this is where many people believe he may have committed his life to the Lord. And he said, interestingly enough, in a letter to a clergyman in Illinois, "When I left Springfield, I asked the people to pray for me. I was not a Christian. When I buried my son, the severest trial of my life, I was not a Christian. But when I went to Gettysburg and saw the graves of thousands of our soldiers, I then and there consecrated myself to Christ." And so let me end with his declaration. He said, "We have been the recipients of the choicest bounties of heaven, and we have been preserved these many days and years in peace and prosperity. We have grown in numbers, wealth, and power as no other nation has ever grown, but we have forgotten God. We have forgotten the gracious hand which preserved us in peace and multiplied and enriched and strengthened us, and we have vainly imagined in the deceitfulness of our hearts that all these blessings were produced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own. Intoxicated with unbroken success, we have become too self-sufficient to feel the necessity of redeeming and preserving grace, too proud to pray to the God that made us. It behooves us now to humble ourselves before the offending power, to confess our national sins, and pray for clemency and forgiveness." You know, this Thanksgiving system and season, I think it's really important for us to maybe return to some of the wisdom of the Pilgrims. This first hour, I've talked about some of the lessons we can learn from Thanksgiving. Second hour, I want to talk about some of the other lessons we can learn from America's godly heritage, but I hope that this will be a blessed time for you and your family. And if you'd like to know some more about some of the things we're talking about today here on Point of View, visit our website, pointofview.net. We come back, we'll talk about America's godly heritage and lessons we can learn that we need to apply today in the 21st century. We'll be right back.
At dinner recently, I was struck by the couple in front of me. They were allegedly spending a night out together, but the only time they communicated in a half hour was one time when the man showed what was on his phone to the woman, and then back to their own screens. We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You'll find us online with your phone, your tablet, your laptop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues. You can also follow our new YouTube video series, Uncensored. Stay informed. Follow us on Twitter, at Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Again, at Point of View RTS. We'd love you to retweet us, to share our Facebook posts, but please don't do it when you're out with your family or someone you love. We can wait. We're online 24 hours a day. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. It is our pre-Thanksgiving program, and in the first hour, if you were not with us, we spent some time talking about some of the lessons we can learn from Thanksgiving. Also read a little bit from one of the articles we've posted by Jarrett Stepman. Here's why we should still celebrate the pilgrims at Thanksgiving. And we also have our Thanksgiving quiz, which I would encourage you to download and use that as a conversation starter around the Thanksgiving table, so we can use this to teach about some very important issues. This hour, I want to pull some material from a very good book, came out many years ago, called One Nation Under God, written by David Gibbs and by Jerry Newcomb. Both of them been on the program. Jerry Newcomb's been on more recently, and his column that came out today is entitled "The Pilgrims Gave Thanks Despite Many Difficulties." And he said, I just finished reading a phenomenal book on the group of dissident Christians who founded Plymouth in 1620. The book's written by historian Rod Gregg. The book is entitled The Pilgrim Chronicles, an eyewitness history of the Pilgrims and the founding of Plymouth Colony. It came out a couple of years ago. We have done interviews with him on that book, and sometimes at Thanksgiving we even play that interview again because it was so well done. And so, again, one of the things I thought Jerry Newcomb said was interesting. I thought I knew a lot about the Pilgrims, but this book added greatly to my knowledge. And this piece goes into how, again, they were separatist, how that when they would oftentimes try to meet in church meetings, those were illegal. And so because of the persecution, decided to emigrate to Holland, but then left there as well. And several of the men, nevertheless, were betrayed and ended up in an English jail. So this is why eventually, even though they were in the Netherlands, they wanted to come to the New World. And yet, as I pointed out before, and we'll get into this in just a few minutes, when they came to the New World, they landed about 250 miles north of their target. They couldn't sail south, and so that caused them to put together a compact or a contract known as the Mayflower Compact. And it goes into the kinds of things that they had to deal with in terms of planting corn and trying to capture eels to survive. Can you imagine that's what you're going to get to eat for dinner, if anything? And then talks about some of the very famous quotes. I thought I might quote from a few of those. One Pilgrim leader, Edward Winslow, said that no one will be losers by following us so far as we follow Christ, which, given the hardship they had after that first horrible winter when 51 of them died, is pretty striking. And then Rod Gregg, in his book, concludes that, and they had succeeded. No one in America would be raiding their Sunday services to stop their worship. Neither would they be hauled off to jail because of their beliefs, nor ever again forced to flee their homes because of their faith. And the way of freedom they blazed in the wilds of the New World would eventually become the path of liberty for countless people from around the world, people yearning for a new life, a new start, a new home, and who would find it as Americans. So that's just a new article out by Jerry Newcomb, and I'm going to be quoting from him and David Gibbs, because one of the things that they have done is write this very good book, and we've made it available in the past, and I'm sure you can find it online, One Nation Under God, 10 Things Every Christian Should Know About the Founding of America. Now, again, if you want to join us and make some comments, that is certainly apropos, but oftentimes the day before Thanksgiving, the phones aren't ringing because people are in their cars driving, they're in their kitchens baking. You may be listening right now, and you certainly don't want to call in. You just want to kind of listen while you're doing the other activities that you're doing around the house in your car, and we certainly understand that. But if you do want to call in, again, the number is 800-351-1212. But I might encourage you, if you have something to write with, you might make that list of the 10 things that every Christian should know. Or if you say, well, I really want to read a little more about that, I haven't really got the time to read a book. I did a week of radio programs on the Probe Radio Show years ago on One Nation Under God. So some of the material I'm going to share with you over this next hour, including some of the end notes and including the list of those 10 things every Christian should know, are there. So if you wanted to use this to, again, teach your children or your grandchildren, this would be a resource that we want to make available to you. So recognize that the Thanksgiving quiz is there for you to really understand how you might want to learn some of these lessons and how you might want to pass this heritage on to your children and grandchildren. We also have a couple of articles, but this one on One Nation Under God is very significant. Well, the first thing that they felt that we should all know is about the idea of the pilgrims. And in the first hour, if you were with us, you heard me speak a little bit about that. But let me give you a real quick summary, recognizing some people maybe did not have a chance to hear what I said last hour. And that is the term pilgrim was not originally given to them. It was something that the colonist William Bradford gave to them based on 1 Peter 2, verse 11. They originally were known as separatists. Sometimes they were known as the forefathers or founders. But as I just alluded to a minute ago, they decided to leave their established settlement in the Leiden, Netherlands, which today would be the Netherlands, and come to the New World in the Mayflower. Well, they were blown off course, although there's some evidence maybe that the sailors actually directed them off course. But whatever, they landed at Cape Cod and settled on a site today which we call the Plymouth Colony. And before they disembarked, of course, they wrote the Mayflower Compact. And one of the quotes I gave last hour, but I thought I would mention it again, from Paul Johnson in a very good book that I would recommend to you, British historian, called A History of the American People. He said what was remarkable about this particular contract, that is the Mayflower Compact, was that it was not between a servant and a master, or a people and a king, but between a group of like-minded individuals and each other, with God as a witness and symbolic co-signatory. And so we can see some of the lessons of religious liberty, because William Brewster, as I've already mentioned, led this group of separatists to Leiden in the Netherlands because they were trying to escape the religious persecution in England. Well, then they weren't pleased with what was happening there, so that's when they decided to come to the New World to experience religious freedom. And as I shared the last hour, not only do we have a very good, if you will, spiritual, religious kind of lesson, we also have a very important economic lesson because William Bradford, seeing the failure of communal farming, instituted what today we would call kind of free enterprise innovations, in which he assigned plots to each family that they could work for their own benefit. And so they were really challenged to better themselves in their land and work to their full capacity. So that's the first thing, the lesson we can learn about the Pilgrims. We have 9 more to go, but we'll also take some of your phone calls if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We come back, we're going to talk about the Puritans, going to talk about some of the other, if you will, dissident groups. We'll eventually work our way to the American Revolution, the First Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening, and a variety of other lessons that are really important, all part of this One Nation Under God. And again, the book is available, but my summary of that is available for free right there on the Point of View website. Let's take a break, come back, and continue our conversation, take some calls right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Thanksgiving is tomorrow, and I suspect that you are doing lots of things to get ready for this special day. Let me suggest you add one more item to your to-do list. Visit our website and download a copy of my Thanksgiving quiz. Thanksgiving is a wonderful time to gather as a family, but I also believe that it can be a great time to teach our children and grandchildren about America's godly heritage. I created this short quiz to be a conversation starter around the Thanksgiving table. You know, we used to go around the table before the meal and ask our children to tell us what they were thankful for. After a few years of hearing about how they were thankful for their cat, their doll, their video games, I knew we needed to do something else. The Thanksgiving quiz was born out of that frustration. It has 19 questions and answers on the Pilgrims and the Mayflower Compact, as well as some questions and answers about the Christian heritage of America. Who were the Pilgrims, and why did they leave Europe for America? Why did they celebrate Thanksgiving? What is the Mayflower Compact, and why is it significant? What lessons did the Pilgrims learn about work and even free enterprise? How did the Christian faith influence America? These are just a few of the sort of questions that you can ask around the table and give short answers. Perhaps it is time to recapture the importance of Thanksgiving. On the bicentennial celebration of the landing of the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock, Daniel Webster declared the following: "Let us not forget the religious character of our origin. Our fathers were brought hither by their high veneration for the Christian religion. They journeyed by its light and labored in its hope, and they sought to incorporate its principles with the elements of their society and diffuse its influence through all their institutions, civil, political, or literary." It is my hope that this quiz will help your family see the importance of Thanksgiving. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Affirm Films and Sony Pictures Animation present The Star, the first Christmas through a whole new set of eyes. The Star, now playing rated PG, thestarmovie.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Pre-Thanksgiving show today, and if you would like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. First hour, we talked about some of the lessons from Thanksgiving. Right now, working our way through some of the historical issues that we can apply about, again, America's godly heritage. And let's take some phone calls along the way as we continue our teaching. Let's head to Alabama first. Ken, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Good afternoon, Kerby. I thought I'd give you just a little tidbit, a little human interest story. Several years ago, when my father passed away, I met with the vice president of the Clark Memorial Company here in Birmingham to make final arrangements for my father's cemetery marker there. And in this gentleman's office, I'm sorry, I can't think of his name at the moment, but anyway, he had all the pictures of the Ten Commandments monument that he made for Judge Roy Moore.
Wow.
Very wonderful and very decorative, great piece of artwork, I thought. And, of course, totally, completely illegal, I think, what they did to make him remove it and everything, but that's another story for another day. But anyway, we got to talking about families, and I said my father had traced our family history quite extensively. And he said, oh, yes, I've traced my family history also. And he said, I have traced our family history all the way back to one of the Pilgrims that stepped off of the Mayflower.
Wow. And, of course, you have the Mayflower Society. So I've run into some people over the years that have their, especially when I lived in the New England area, ran into people that actually could trace their heritage back. Isn't that amazing?
Wow. Yeah, there's probably not very many people that can do that, much less know that they are descendants from someone from the Mayflower. So anyway, I thought that was just very interesting. I just thought you'd get a kick out of that quick little story. So
fascinating.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Well, thank you for calling, and happy Thanksgiving to you. And we'll take some more phone calls in just a minute. But again, if you're taking some notes, we're going to try to go through all 10. We'll see how we do, because I want to take some phone calls along the way as well. But we first of all talked about how important it is to know first about the Pilgrims. Number two, the Puritans. Okay, the first thing you've got to maybe have in your mind is, okay, what's the difference between a Pilgrim and a Puritan? Well, a Pilgrim was known as a separatist, and that is they believed that it was not possible to reform the Church of England, so they wanted to separate. And so this would be like individuals that you know, or maybe even you, where you find yourself in a liberal church or a liberal denomination, and you finally say there's no hope, and you leave the church or you leave the denomination. So that would be what a Pilgrim would be, because they were known as the separatist. A Puritan, on the other hand, said that they wanted to purify the church, and so they wanted to purify it from within. And that would be like individuals that we've talked about on this program who maybe decided to stay within a church, to stay within a denomination and fight for the doctrinal purity of the church. And so the Puritans are those who came after the Pilgrims, actually settled in a place called Massachusetts Bay Colony, and as I mentioned in the first hour, had a concern that there was no written constitution. And so the Puritans decided to anchor their liberties on a written page. And you can read more about this in the article we've posted today on the website. This is really a tradition from the Bible. And as I mentioned in the last hour, that if you look at, for example, the Body of Liberties, this was written in 1641. It had 98 separate protections of individual rights. So this way you could see the individual rights and the importance there. And these would include things like a due process of law, which we take for granted today. Equal protection, certainly that is a foundational principle of our constitutional republic. Trial by a jury of your peers, and even prohibitions against cruel and unusual punishment. You've heard that phrase before, haven't you? And that is, it's the Eighth Amendment in the Constitution. So I think it illustrates again some of those ideas. While we're talking about this, I did mention Jamestown a few minutes ago, and that is, I think, another great illustration of some of the economic lessons that we've learned. Thomas Dale realized that there was no correlation between work and reward, so that's why he gave each one of the men 3 acres of land and required them to work no more than a month for that. So certainly we can look at the Pilgrims and the Puritans. Let's now get to the religious revivals, and that would be the First Great Awakening. Jonathan Edwards said that the revival broke out in his church in 1734 like a flash of lightning. Perhaps the most notable individual is George Whitefield. Just came back from going to the Museum of the Bible, and there's a whole section where you can actually sit and listen to part of a sermon and some discussion about George Whitefield, because it's a section in the Museum of the Bible on the impact of the Bible in America. And here is an individual that was traveling up and down the eastern seaboard. And Paul Johnson, who I quoted just a minute ago, British historian, concluded that as many as 3 out of every 4 American colonists were directly affected by George Whitefield, which shows you how tenacious Whitefield was during the First Great Awakening. But it also sounded, as Paul Johnson says, the death knell to British colonialism, because it united the colonies together for the first time. They no longer thought of themselves as simply a colony in South Carolina of England or a colony in Massachusetts of England. They began to think of themselves as Americans. And so that was very significant. And in some respects, many people believe that if you did not have the First Great Awakening, might not have had the American Revolution. I don't want to be overly dogmatic about that, but it is interesting to see how many of those ideas certainly led to what eventually became the American Revolution. Well, let's get on to a next point. We've talked about the Pilgrims. We've talked about the Puritans. We've talked about religious revival. Let's talk about another aspect of that, and that is the clergy in America, because this was very significant as well. You know, John Adams in 1818 really spent some time trying to explain to people who did not understand the American Revolution where it came from. And so John Adams wrote what was called The Meaning of the American Revolution in 1818. Now, again, it's important to remind ourselves who was John Adams. Well, John Adams was one of the individuals who was part of the committee that drafted the Declaration of Independence. That was Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, Roger Sherman, and numbers. And more importantly, he was the first vice president of the United States. He became the second president of the United States, and his son later became president as well. Well, he said that the revolution, the American Revolution, was affected before the war commenced. He said the revolution was in the mind and the hearts of the people, and change in their religious sentiments of their duties and obligations. So he began to list some of the people most significant and the people that really are responsible in some ways for the American Revolution. Now, you can think about where you are listening to this broadcast today and think of a university near your town, near your city, wherever you happen to be located. And you can imagine if we were to go up and talk to one of the history professors that teaches American history, who would they say were most important in terms of bringing about the American Revolution? I think the answers would be, I don't know, maybe the Declaration then they'd mention Thomas Jefferson or Benjamin Franklin, might mention George Washington, they might mention Samuel Adams, some other people, maybe John Adams, some others, but it's interesting that John Adams, who was there, he mentions two individuals in particular, Dr. Mayhew and Dr. Cooper. Now, unless you're really a student of history, you've got to say, I have no idea who these people are. Well, it turns out that Reverend Jonathan Mayhew was a minister of West Church in Boston, and his contribution was that he wrote and delivered a very famous sermon on civil disobedience, because key to the colonists and the patriots was, is there ever a time when we would disobey the British government? And so he takes them through some of the examples in the Old and New Testament. And then this particular sermon is reprinted and read by many. And for the first time, they can see that maybe the possibility of a revolution is at least theoretically possible. And so that's one of the things that John Adams recognized was so significant. Dr. Samuel Cooper, Brattle Street in Boston, you probably know some of the people in his congregation. Let's see, that would be John Hancock. Of course, we mentioned John Adams, Samuel Adams, some of those people that actually were involved in some of the initial skirmishes were known as the Minutemen. So you can see how some of these preachers were very important. And John Adams used to say that the Philadelphia preachers thunder and lightning every Sabbath against George III's despotism. Thomas Jefferson said pulpit oratory ran like a shock of electricity through the whole colony. So we've looked at a couple of very important things that give us our understanding of American history. When we come back, I want to talk about our education. I want to talk about the Constitution and the Declaration, and once again help you understand how important some of these really key biblical principles were in the founding of this country. We'll talk about that right after these important messages.
Does point of view make any difference? I think Dr. Eric Walsh would say it does. Dr. Walsh was fired from his job as district health director for the state of Georgia, not because of anything he did or failed to do on the job, but because of sermons he preached in his local church. What does that have to do with point of view? Jeremy Dyes of First Liberty represented Dr. Walsh, and in February, the state of Georgia paid a large settlement for their religious discrimination. And Jeremy Dyes became an attorney specializing in defending religious liberty, greatly because of what he learned listening to Point of View Radio as a child. That is the kind of difference you make when you support the Truth Team, but we can't make that difference without your help. Become a partner today in this important mission of speaking truth in love. Join the Truth Team at pointofview.net/team. Choose your giving level, stretch a bit, and please do it today. Or call 800-347-5151. pointofview.net/team or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Hope you're having a wonderful pre-Thanksgiving day. We certainly are enjoying it around here. And if you happen to be out and about, certainly sit back and listen. If you'd like to join us a little bit later, 1-800-351-1212. Don't want to take too many phone calls because we wanted to do kind of a teaching today. And in the first hour, if you're just now joining us, we spent some time talking about lessons from Thanksgiving. I've posted a very good article by Jarrett Stepman on here's why we should still celebrate the Pilgrims at Thanksgiving. We have our Thanksgiving quiz, which again I want to make available to any of you. It is both posted as my Viewpoints commentary today with links. It also is available in the website pointofview.net, so you can find it in that regard, and it's a way that you can use the 20 questions to ask some questions around the table, see what kind of answers you get from your children and grandchildren, or even from the adults. Some of the questions are very simple. Some of the questions are a little more complex. And right now, working our way through this idea of one nation under God. So if you don't have a chance to write down some of the notes or would like to check these out or find some of the end notes that I'm quoting from or the quotations, those are available as well. It's the third article we've posted today on the website pointofview.net. Up until now, we've talked a little bit about the history of America from a biblical perspective. What were some of the instrumental and important issues in terms of both the Pilgrims and the Puritans? And then we also talked about the First Great Awakening, and we also talked about the clergy, which, interesting enough, I forgot to mention this, were oftentimes referred to by the British as the Black Regiment. What they meant by that is, since they wore the black robes, interestingly enough, they were seen as sort of this third column or fifth column or whatever phrase you want to use. I guess they usually use the phrase fifth column. And that is, it was these things that these Puritan pastors and these Congregationalist pastors and a variety of others that were preaching from the pulpit that as a result led in some ways to encouragement and even to the development of the military forces that fought against them in the American Revolution. So we've looked at a couple of those issues, the Pilgrims, the Puritans, the First Great Awakening, and the clergy. Let me now focus on one more, and that is education. It's important to recognize that education originally in this country was very biblically based. And one of the things I have in my article and also a visual presentation that I give is from the New England Primer. Now, if you've never seen a New England Primer, it's, I think, an illustration of how thoroughly biblical education used to be. And now we're moving from the 17th century really into the 18th century. Just even teaching the alphabet was interesting because it had the word A, in Adam's fall, we sinned all. B, helping to find the Bible mind. C, Christ crucified for sinners died. You can see that even as you were teaching something as simple as your ABCs, you were also teaching basic theology. Of course, it had all sorts of hymns and Westminster Shorter Catechism, Isaac Watts, a variety of other things. And one of the reasons some of this existed is because there was a real desire on the part, especially of the Puritans, but almost all the colonists, to provide good education for the citizenry, in part so that they could read the Bible for themselves. They are now the inheritors of the Reformation. They now have access to Bibles. And so if you've ever been on maybe what's called the Freedom Trail in Boston, there used to be a sign. Last time I was there, they took it down, I suspect. But one sign talked about the Old Deluder Act. And this was a bill that was passed. It was a law that said that they wanted to defeat Satan, the old deluder, who had used illiteracy in the old world to keep people from reading God's word. So the desire and the purpose of these Puritan New England schools was to teach children so they could read the Bible for themselves. And so literacy was a really important issue because they did not want to have to depend on some priest or some preacher or whatever. They wanted to be able to help everyone read the Bible for themselves and to learn and understand it. If you look at the major institutions of higher education at that time, Harvard Colony was established, Harvard College, which today, of course, is Harvard University. And if you look at the laws and statutes of Harvard College in 1643, here's what it said. Let every student be plainly instructed and earnestly pressed to consider well the main end of his life and studies, that is, to know God and Jesus Christ, which is eternal life, John 17:3. So if you look at the laws and statutes at that time of Harvard College, the idea and the goal was to be able to know God and Jesus Christ, and that is what we have instituted this college to actually do. If you go to Yale College, even in its regulations, it makes these statements as well. If you look at the actual brochure, it's on really the kind of the second or third page, but you go down to that section on the regulations of Yale College. In 1745, it said this: all scholars shall live religious, godly, and blameless lives according to the rules of God's Word, diligently reading the Holy Scriptures, the fountain of light and truth, and constantly attend upon all the duties of religion, both in public and secret. I would suggest to you that if you're establishing a Christian school and you want to have the requirements for every student in that Christian school, you couldn't do much better than what were the regulations at Yale College in 1745. Let's talk about another aspect of this country, and that is the importance of prayer. I mentioned a little of this in the first hour when we talked about some of the spiritual lessons from Thanksgiving, but one of the most significant was that the American Revolution did not go well in 1776. And after the Declaration, about 5 months after the Declaration of Independence, the testimony before Congress was the pinch and suffering of war and a poor harvest seriously imperiled morale. There are some real doubts as to whether or not George Washington, General George Washington, could have kept enough of the regulars, along with even the militia, after 1776. And so Congress set aside December 11th, 1776, as a day of fasting and repentance. George Washington later reflected upon God's provision for him and how that protected him in the Battle of Long Island, but also reflected on the first victories and the only victories he had in 1776. Minor that they were, they certainly provided encouragement, the Battle of Trenton and Princeton. Now, if you look at even before that time, prayer was so important in the founding not only of this country, but even the beginning of the idea of a Congress. The first Continental Congress met in 1774, and it was opened with the time of public prayer. Perhaps you've seen the painting that was actually painted, in which you have all sorts of different individuals. There was a real debate as to whether or not we could even bring in a chaplain, because after all, you had Puritans, and you had Congregationalists, you had Quakers, you had maybe a few Baptists, Catholics, others. You had just a real diversity. Even among the Protestants, quite a bit of diversity, and yet they decided to gather together under Reverend Juchet, and this painting is a very striking picture of these men kneeling and praying before the First Continental Congress, a tradition that was continued on. Last hour, we talked about some of the traditions of Thanksgiving, and George Washington called for a day of Thanksgiving after the third year of the war. And Congress also had many times in which they had times of thanksgiving as well. So we can see that prayer was really important in the founding of this country. Prayer was even more important in the framing of the government. And then, of course, prayer has been important since the first days all the way up to the most recent National Day of Prayer and the declarations of a time of prayer that have been issued all the way up to our current president, Donald Trump. Well, let's take a break. When we come back, I want to spend just a few more minutes, if I can, talking about what about the Christian influence on two very important documents. We've been talking about them, but what has been the Christian influence? The influence on the Declaration of Independence and the Christian influence on the Constitution of the United States. And then we'll wind down for today. Let me mention again, if you just joined us, that we've got a lot of resources that I hope that you will take advantage of. The Thanksgiving quiz is one of those resources that we certainly want to put in your hands. And as I've been teaching through in this second hour here on One Nation Under God, Of course, there's the book by that title, and I'm borrowing lots of material from that, but adding some of my own. We also have a very good summary that I've done, which is available on our website, pointofview.net, under the subtitle One Nation Under God, so that you can read some of that material and find the endnotes, check it out for yourself, and then teach it to your children and grandchildren. Let's take a break. When we come back, what were the Christian influences on the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution? We'll answer that question right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Can county commissioners open their own meetings with prayer? The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit recently prohibited Rowan County's commissioners from opening their meetings with prayer. But the federal courts of appeal are split over whether prayers offered by legislators at local government meetings are unconstitutional. In another one of our cases, Bournemouth versus County of Jackson, the Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit approved of the very same practice. Opening government meetings with prayer is a centuries-old tradition that goes back to before the founding of our nation and continues to this day before Congress, state houses, and thousands of local governments across the country. It shouldn't be very controversial. The Supreme Court previously approved of the long-standing tradition of legislative prayer and its role in solemnizing policymaking sessions, encouraging lawmakers to selflessly seek the greater good, and acknowledging the role that faith plays in the lives of millions of Americans. In 1983, in Marsh v. Chambers, and then again in Town of Greece v. Galloway, the Supreme Court held that prayers offered by private citizens before government meetings are fully consistent with the Constitution and an important part of America's history and heritage. But what if that citizen is an elected official? That's the question we hope the Supreme Court will now answer. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. You can protect your religious freedom by going to firstliberty.org to download your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit. Our attorneys created kits for churches, ministries, Christian schools, military members, students, and teachers, and the workplace. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, as we talk about one nation under God, and I thought I would conclude by looking at the Christian influence in both the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. And again, it's maybe helpful to understand the difference. In some respects, the Declaration of Independence tells the why of American government. Why do we have a separate nation from England, and why was there a desire on the part of colonists to separate and to declare a revolution? Then the Constitution is sort of the how of American government. But let's look at the Declaration for just a minute. Many people look at the Declaration and say, well, it doesn't look all that biblical. Well, not necessarily, but certainly biblical ideas were behind it. Not all of the individuals that signed the Declaration were Christians by any stretch of the imagination, but a very high percentage of them were, and I'll talk about more of that in a minute. But we do see some very definite ideas. And one of those is simply the fact that God is mentioned either directly or indirectly 4 times in the Declaration of Independence. The first is that you see this idea of the laws of nature and nature's God. I'll come back to what that meant in just a minute in terms of the writings of John Locke, but that certainly talks about the idea of nature's God. Then, of course, after the first revision, there were some other things that were added to the Declaration that was signed, and that is, first of all, the idea that individuals, that we are endowed by what? Our Creator, by certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Then we also see that there was a question on the part of the colonists and the rebels, if you will, as to whether or not they were doing the right thing. And so then the document, it also says that they were appealing to the supreme judge of the world. And then finally, we see that they are calling for protection of divine providence with a capital P, because they understood that they were about ready to engage militarily into the greatest military power of the 18th century. So you can see on 4 separate occasions, either explicitly or implicitly, God is mentioned in the Declaration. Now, what about this idea of the law of nature? Well, that really comes from John Locke. We talked about a little bit this the other day with John Eidsmoe, who's on the program with us. The law of nature, according to John Locke's 2 treatises of government, said the law of nature is God's general revelation, which is written in our hearts. Then the law of God is, of course, God's eternal moral law revealed and published in Scripture. So those ideas certainly came from John Locke. And Thomas Jefferson was very honest about the fact that what he wrote about was very much reforming and, if you will, refashioning of existing ideas. And some of the other ideas came from something he was very familiar with, the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which was constructed by George Mason. If you ever go to Williamsburg, you get to go through the house of George Mason. George Mason is kind of seen as the author of the Second Amendment. But the Virginia Declaration of Rights said that all men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights, namely the enjoyment of life and liberty and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. That sounds a lot like the Declaration, doesn't it? In this hour, I've quoted from Paul Johnson. Let me quote from him one more time in his book, A History of the American People. He says, "There is no question that the Declaration of Independence was, to those who signed it, a religious as well as secular act, and that the Revolutionary War have the approbation of divine providence." So that's just a little bit on the Declaration. But what about the Constitution? Well, there are lots of ways we can look at this, but my major professor at Georgetown University, working with other professors who actually wrote the articles, looking at, these are professors, by the way, at LSU and University of Houston and others, looked at all the writings of constitutional scholars during the founding era, found about 3,000 citations, and found that the Bible was quoted more than anything else, 34% of the time. But interestingly enough, most of those quotations actually came from sermons of that era. So it's interesting that the sermons of preachers and pastors of the 18th century were the ideas that eventually made their way into the Constitution. So you can see, again, the preaching of the pulpits were very instrumental in giving us the Constitution that we enjoy today. Let me take one individual that is worth a significant mention, and that is somebody I mentioned before, John Witherspoon, who at the time was the president of the College of New Jersey, now known as Princeton. He taught James Madison, who we just mentioned, 77 members of Congress, 3 Supreme Court justices. Even though he was a pastor, he signed the Declaration of Independence and preached a very famous sermon on the dominion of providence over the affairs of men. And John Eidsmoe, who we had on the program the other day in his book, Christianity and the Constitution, put it this way. He said, "One thing is certain, the Christian religion, particularly Reverend Witherspoon's Calvinism, which emphasized the fallen nature of man, influenced Madison's view of law and government." We read a lot more about that in the Federalist Papers, which were written by James Madison, by Alexander Hamilton, and by John Jay. You may know the first 2. James Madison is well known. Alexander Hamilton, there's a play right now about him in New York, but you might say, who's John Jay? Well, at the time he wrote the Federalist Papers, he was the vice president of the American Bible Society. Later, he became the president of the American Bible Society. And interesting enough, he also became the first Chief Justice of the United States. The man who was the president of the American Bible Society became the first Chief Justice of the United States. And if that doesn't show you the Christian influence, I would encourage you to maybe look at the book by M.E. Bradford called A Worthy Company, in which he estimates at least 50, perhaps even as high as 52 of the 55 men who signed the Constitution were church members who actually endorsed the Christian faith. So as we wind down today, I've got a question for you. I think anybody watching this presentation, listening to this presentation, reading the article that I've posted there, or reading the book, One Nation Under God, would have to conclude, if they were fair-minded at all, that Christianity was really important in the founding of this country, and Christianity was really important in the framing of its government. So here's my question. If Christianity was so important in the founding of this republic, why do so many think that it is irrelevant to the maintenance of this republic? Well, I think we have the answer. It is important, and that's why we as Christians need to stand for biblical truth. And this is why, as we come to this Thanksgiving celebration, we encourage you to get some of the resources we're making available here at Point of View. And I hope that you would take the time to pass this on to the next generation. As you've listened to me talk today, I suspect some of you have said, there's some things I did not know. And I guarantee you there are a lot of things that my children and grandchildren do not know. Well, they don't know them because we haven't taught them. But now I've taught some of them to you. I encourage you to pass them on to them as well. Let me encourage you to visit the website, pointofview.net. We have that first article on why we should still celebrate Thanksgiving. We have the Thanksgiving quiz, which is available to you to print out and to ask those 20 questions around the table and have some conversation and educate others. And then we have this piece that I've been talking about over the last hour on One Nation Under God. Thought I'd dress up as a pilgrim today just to get us in the spirit of Thanksgiving. And tomorrow, of course, there's lots of food, there's lots of fun, there's lots of football. But don't forget the pilgrims, and don't forget some of the lessons we can learn from Thanksgiving. And if we pass some of that on to you, then we fulfilled our function and our ministry to you. So again, visit the website, pointofview.net. If you'd like to listen to more about this, you can download the podcast or watch the YouTube channel. You can also read some of the articles I've posted. So we want to wish you and your family a happy Thanksgiving. Also want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Enjoy Thanksgiving. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
You're riding down the road, and just ahead you see an elderly woman tumble off the curb into the street. As your friend drives past, she prays, "Lord, please send someone to help that poor woman," and drives on. What if that was your mother or grandmother? In Christ, our family includes people like Sarah. Sarah was